So last week, what happened? What was last week's story? What happened to Israel? Okay, what happened to them as a whole? They were taken into slavery. They were taken away into captivity. The Assyrian king attacked, and the Lord let them be taken into captivity. We were in 2 Kings chapter 17, and I told you that this week we will start Hezekiah, and we're going to have an introduction to Hezekiah, but there's a section of 2 Kings chapter 17, that last section beginning at verse 24, that I think is important for us to know, not necessarily in this list of kings and where we're at, but when we're studying Scripture, when you're reading in the New Testament, and I'm going to show you why, this section is very important and was very interesting to me. And so we're going to look at this section before we look at Hezekiah. So 2 Kings chapter 17 and verse 24, and keeping in mind that many of the Israelites were carried off. If you were any part of the leadership, any part of the religious structure, anyone who they, part of the military, anyone who they thought might be a threat, they were taken off to other lands and relocated. But there were some who went as refugees into Judah, and then there were some Israelites who just stayed in the land and were there. The ones who the Assyrians deemed as no threat. And so then 2 Kings chapter 17 verse 24 says, "And the king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Cuthath, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim," I should have practiced saying that, "and placed them in the cities of Samaria instead of the people of Israel, and they took possession of Samaria and lived in its cities." And so the Assyrians were doing the same thing with the other lands that they had taken captive. They relocated some of the influential Israelites to other lands. Well, in the other lands, they took their people of influence and moved them into Israel. And so there was a crossing of nationalities there. And that's what the Assyrians did in order to keep their kingdom safe from a revolt from within. Verse 25 says, but they had a problem with Israel that they didn't experience in the other lands. And verse 25 tells us about that. "At the beginning of their dwelling there, they did not fear the Lord. Therefore, the Lord sent lions among them, which killed some of them." And so these people that had been relocated to Israel were all of a sudden being attacked by lions and killed. And so they send messages to the king of Assyria and say, "We got a problem." And so the king of Assyria sends, it says, a priest of the Israelites back to the land to teach them about the Lord of this land, to teach them who Yahweh was. And this priest came in, and so he teaches the people from Babylon and Cuthath and Ava and Hamath who God is. And so it doesn't tell us the details, but I would imagine that he taught them from Moses all the way up to current day. And so he taught them about Moses and being in Egypt as captives, and Moses leading them out of Egypt and across the Red Sea. And he led, our God led by a pillar of fire and a pillar of cloud. And then I would imagine that he taught them about David and Solomon and the temple. And this is how our religious structure works. And we offer these sacrifices to the Lord. And he's a jealous God. And he wants us to worship only him. And I just imagine that that's what the priest taught, but we don't know. But so he teaches them about the Lord, verse 29 says, but every nation, all of these nations that have been injected into Israel, the old Israel now, every nation still made gods of its own and put them in the shrines of the high places that the Samaritans had made, every nation in the cities in which they lived. Verse 33 says, so they feared the Lord, but also served their own gods after the manner of the nations from among whom they had been carried away. And so they get a knowledge of God and they fear him for who he is, but they take God and just put him on the shelf with their other gods, and they worship both. It's not a whole lot different than what the Israelites were doing, in that they feared the Lord, but yet they were worshiping these other gods at the same time. But it's just that they had a knowledge of who the Lord was now by the workings of this priest. Verse 41 or verse 41 says, so these nations feared the Lord and also served their carved images. Their children did likewise, and their children's children, as their fathers did, so do they do to this day. And so this short section is important because it is literally the origins of the Samaritans. These people are from this point on. This is the Israelites who have mingled with these other people who have been injected into the land, and they're just doing all kinds of. They know who the Lord is, but they're worshiping their own pagan gods. And they did it, and then their children did it, and then their children's children did it, and so it's generations leading up to what we hear and know in the New Testament as the Samaritans. And we read and know that the Israelites don't like the Samaritans. They don't really have anything to do with them. And now we know why. We see Jesus interact with the Samaritan in John chapter 4. And he meets this woman at the well, and he says to her, give me a drink. And she says to him, why are you even talking to me? I'm a Samaritan woman. Jews don't have anything to do with the Samaritans. And so now when we hear that story, we read that story, it makes a lot more sense to us why they don't have anything to do with them. Because they were half-breeds. They were people who worshiped the Lord and the pagan gods. They were the people who were left over when the Assyrians attacked, and they mingled with the new people who were injected in, and they made this people group known as the Samaritans, and the Jews had nothing to do with them. Of course, Jesus goes on to say, if you only knew who it was that was asking you for a drink, you would ask him for a drink, and he would give you living waters, and you would never thirst again. And she says, how could this be? And if you remember, it leads up to the point where she says, our fathers worship on this mountain. And Jesus says to her in verse 42, you worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. And we see now that is so true. They're just worshiping everything. They knew God, they knew about God, but yet they cling to their little carved images. And Jesus says to her very plainly, you don't know what you worship. The Jews bring salvation. In Luke, Jesus is asked, what is the most important law? And he says to them, love the Lord your God. Have no other gods before him. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. Of course, then the question comes up, well, who is my neighbor? And Jesus tells them this parable about a man who is beaten and he's robbed and he's been left for dead on the side of the road. And the notable citizens pass by. They're too busy. He might be a shady character. We're not going to... And they just go on their way for whatever reason, and they leave him there. And then along comes the who? The Samaritan. And he picks him up, and he takes him to a hotel, and he pays for his stay, and he pays for his care, and he leaves a little extra just in case you need more until I can come back by and pay the bill off completely. So Jesus then turns around the question, well, who is the neighbor? And of course, the Samaritan. The one who doesn't even know who they worship. Turns out to be the neighbor. And the lesson in that parable is that how much more should the child of God be able to recognize the needs of those around him than those who are of the world, those who don't even know who they worship. Of all people, we who know Christ and have experienced His grace and His mercy and His love, we should be able to recognize the need and have a desire to help in that area of need. There's so much more to Christ than just salvation. He calls us not only to give us a ticket into heaven, but to serve in His kingdom, to feed the hungry, to clothe the poor, to render aid and comfort to those in need. And that's what He's teaching here. If the Samaritans can recognize the need, how much more should you, my children, care for your neighbor? And you remember I've told you many times the need seen, we should view a need seen as a command given. If you see a need, then it's very likely that the Lord is opening your eyes to see that need. And He's not telling you that somebody ought to take care of that. He's telling you that you are the person to take care of that. Whether it's a piece of trash on the floor or a family in need. If you see that need and you have the ability to help that need, it's very likely that the need seen is a command given. And so there's the history of the Samaritans in that little passage. I thought it was interesting and worth seeing that the Lord sent lions, so they're going to at least know who God is, whose land they've possessed. And then out of that people come a group known as the Samaritans that we read a lot about. And there are other stories about the Samaritans in the New Testament. And so now you know where they come from and how they developed into a people of their own. And I promised a quick introduction to Hezekiah. So we move on into 2 Kings chapter 18. It says, in the third year of Hosea, remember he was the king last week, in the third year of Hosea, son of Elah, king of Israel, Hezekiah, the son of Ahaz, king of Judah, began to reign. He was 25 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Abi, the daughter of Zechariah, and he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, according to all that David his father had done. He removed the high places and broke the pillars and cut down the Asherah. And he broke in pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made. For until those days, the people of Israel had made offerings to it. It was called Nahashtan. Verse 5, he trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel, so that there was none like him among all the gods of Judah after him, nor among those, none like him among all the kings of Judah after him, nor among those who were before him. For he held fast to the Lord. He did not depart from following him, but kept the commandments that the Lord commanded Moses. And the Lord was with him. Wherever he went out, he prospered. He rebelled against the king of Assyria and would not serve him. He struck down the Philistines as far as Gaza and its territory, from watchtower to fortified city. And so in these 8 verses, we get a beautiful look at what's coming. Hezekiah is a great king. Just look at the verse 3. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. Verse 5, he trusted in the Lord. Verse 6, he held fast to the Lord. And verse 7, the Lord was with him. And so, what a turnaround from all the other kings we've looked at up to this point. Hezekiah is in Judah. And with that introduction, you know good things are going to happen in his reign. And right off the bat, he destroys the bronze serpent, which, how did it make it so long? How was it still there? How was it not destroyed or carried off in all the other kings? But the answer, I guess, is in the text where it says that they were making offerings to it as its own god. They had made this. Do you remember the bronze serpent? The Lord was punishing the people, and so he sent poisonous snakes in them, and the poisonous snake, if they were bit by the poisonous snake, if they would but look at this bronze serpent, they would live. That's where we get the song, Look and Live. It was a picture of Christ being raised. If we would but look to him. We've all been bitten by sin. And if we would but look to Christ, we will live. And that bronze serpent represented that. And they've taken it and made it its own God, gave it its own name, and we're offering monies to it. And so what does Hezekiah do? First thing right off the bat, he goes in and destroys it. You're not going to worship these false gods. You're not going to try to mix. We worship one God, the Lord Jehovah God. He is our God. He is who we worship. And Hezekiah begins right off the bat straightening them out. Now there's a little overlap. Hezekiah actually begins to reign while his father Ahaz is still alive. And we don't know really at what point, if he's just getting things in order and then as soon as his father dies, he begins to sweep through, or if he takes over and starts from the beginning, straightening things out. But what we see is that Hezekiah brings great reform to Judah. And what a contrast in these two, what we've read. What a contrast from the Samaritans who were superficially fearing the Lord and then serving their own gods. What a contrast between them and Hezekiah, who loved the Lord with all his heart. And what's even more about Hezekiah is that he is the son of Ahaz. You remember how he was the worst king ever? We talked about in Sunday school how the Lord is no respecter of persons. You know, it doesn't matter from where you have come, who was your mother and father, grandparents, your family line. What God looks at is your faithfulness. And your relationship with God isn't dependent on their relationship with God. You will stand before God on your own accord and give account for your own life, for your own actions, for your own words. Grandma, grandpa, mom, dad, brother, sister cannot help you in that instance. It is you standing on your own merits. What a change we see from Ahaz to Hezekiah. As our song leader and our pianist come, Hezekiah's, what we see in him, in his reign, in his life, in his actions, it should challenge each one of us to examine our own hearts. Do I fear the Lord? Do I fear the Lord just because I know who He is, and yet I still try to worship my own gods? The problems that the Samaritans have is a very real problem in America. People know of God, they know of the Lord, but yet they want to worship how they want to worship, when they want to worship, in their way, in their style. And I want to make it comfortable for me. I want it to be convenient for me. I want it to be whatever. It's not all about the Lord. And our God is, as we said, a jealous God. He will not honor those who acknowledge Him and yet worship other things in their lives. And so Hezekiah coming along from the family that he comes from, it should challenge us. It should challenge us to examine our own hearts. Do I serve the Lord? Do I serve the Lord with every fiber of my being? Are my random thoughts about God? Are my greatest desires and hopes and aims in life about pleasing Him, being obedient to Him? Do I love the Lord with all my heart, with all my soul, with all my mind, with all my strength? Do I love my neighbor as myself? Those are what Jesus put forward as the two most important of all the commandments. And if we could just get past that first one, to love the Lord with all that we are, He's everything. He's everything. Let's all stand.
305.